You're listening to a Rock Candy podcast.
What exactly makes Beyoncé the queen bee?
How do we feel about Ariana Grande's use of rap vernacular?
And most importantly, what's better, chamomile or spiced chai?
We ponder all of this and more on Hot Tea, Hot Takes, now a part of the Rock Candy Podcast Network.
Our show is just two friends drinking tea and discussing music, culture, politics, and anything else that comes to mind.
We cover everything from Mozart to Megan Thee Stallion.
New uploads are posted weekly. Look for it wherever you get your podcast. We'll see you soon.
Bye!
This is Sacred Tension, the podcast about the discipline of asking questions. My name is Stephen Bradford Long, and we are here on the Rock Candy Podcast Network. For more shows like this one, go to rockcandyrecordings.com. All right. Well, before we get started with this show, as always, I have to thank my patrons. For this week, I have to thank Bryson, Bridget Nix, Reverend Jaden, and Greg. Thank you so much. I truly could not do this show without you. You are maintaining this show, ensuring that I can bring you interesting content to the public for free. And if you would like to join their number, please go to patreon.com/Stephen Bradford Long. And for $1 a month or more, you get extra content every single week. And it really, really helps. All right. Well, this week I'm delighted to welcome Philip Goff back to the show. Philip, how's it going?
It's going pretty good. Thanks for having me back. Nice to see you again.
Yes, you too. So we talked in 2020, I believe, right before the pandemic hit.
Right, yeah.
It was like in January or February. Or maybe it was early.
Right.
Maybe it was in 2019, and then I don't remember. I just remember we talked, and then it felt like the world fell apart. But it's great to have you back on. So tell us some about who you are and what you do before we get started.
I am a philosopher. I teach at Durham University up in the cold north of England. And I am interested in reality. I guess I work mainly on consciousness. I'm interested in how to fit consciousness into our overall theory of reality. And I think the traditional scientific approach won't really cut it, and defend a slightly wacky view called panpsychism, which I guess we could get onto. So that's my main focus, but I guess I'm interested in the nature of reality and in many different aspects and facets of it.
Like you also wrote a fantastic book called Galileo's Error. Which
should plug my book.
Yes, you should. You should be. You need to pull yourself together. You need to be better at plugging yourself. But no, Galileo's. I keep wanting to say Galileo's Middle Finger. I'm like, no, that's another book by Alice Drager. Galileo's Error is a defense of panpsychism for a popular audience. So could you describe what panpsychism is? And of course, longtime listeners of the show already know what panpsychism is because I've talked about it before. But to those who are new to the show, what is panpsychism?
Well, the word literally means everything has mind. Pan, everything means everything. Psyche means mind. But the way it's standardly understood these days is it's the view that the fundamental building blocks of reality, perhaps fundamental particles like electrons and quarks, have incredibly simple forms of conscious experience. So, the conscious experience of a human being is very rich and complex. You've got emotions and thoughts and colors and sounds and so on. But conscious experience comes in different shapes and sizes. The experience of a horse is simpler than that of a human being. Experience of a mouse is simpler still. And as we move to simpler and simpler forms of life, we find simpler and simpler forms of conscious experience. For the panpsychist, this keeps on going right down to the basic building blocks of reality, which have incredibly simple forms of experience to reflect their very simple nature. So it doesn't mean literally it doesn't necessarily mean tables and chairs and rocks and planets have consciousness, although some panpsychists do think that. It just means that maybe the things they're ultimately made up of have very simple forms of experience. And so in that sense, consciousness pervades the universe.
So would you say that in the panpsychist view, in the same way an atom has spin and mass, etc., it also has consciousness, by which we mean it is like something to be that atom?
Yeah, pretty much. But the way you described it then sounds a little bit dualistic. And this is a very common thought about panpsychism. And I guess it captures some kinds of panpsychism. But the kind of panpsychism I defend, it's not that the particle has its physical properties like
and then its interior
mass,
properties,
spin, and charge, and these weird consciousness properties,
right? And then like a more spiritual properties, as well, or something.
That's too dualistic. That's like there's two separate aspects. Rather, the view is, strange as it sounds, its physical properties like mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. So that sounds, how do you make sense of that? If you do physics, my genius niece has just started studying physics at Manchester University. She's learning about mass, spin, and charge. Doesn't seem like she's learning about forms of consciousness. But the inspiration, the reason contemporary analytic philosophy has returned to thinking about panpsychism is largely because of certain important work by Bertrand Russell in the 1920s. And what he was doing in the 1920s was just thinking really hard about the fact that physics is purely mathematical. And we sort of take that for granted. But I mean, this was a radical innovation by Galileo. I talk about in my book, Galileo's Error. And since then, physics has been kind of completely mathematical. So Russell's thinking, I guess if you're a scientist, you're often, you just want to do the experiments and get the results. But if you're a philosopher, you want to think, what do we learn about the nature of reality from the fact that physics is purely mathematical? The description it's giving us of the universe is purely mathematical. So there's a couple of ways you could go with that. One reaction is to say, well, maybe that shows that the universe at base is made up of mathematics, is kind of made up of numbers and functions and vectors, the kind of things we find in physics. So that's the position the physicist Max Tegmark defends. But another possible way you can go is to say, well, maybe there's something underlying the mathematical structures physics identifies. Maybe there's something that those mathematical structures are the structures of, Stephen Hawking had this great line in the final page of A Brief History of Time when he said, even the final theory of physics will just be a bunch of equations. It won't tell us what breathes fire into the equations. So the panpsychist idea is what we have at the fundamental level of reality is just these very simple conscious networks of very simple conscious entities with very simple experiences that behave in very simple, predictable ways because they have very simple experiences. And then through their interactions, they form patterns, they form mathematical structures. And then the thought is those mathematical structures are the mathematical structures identified by physicists. It's consciousness that breathes fire into the equations. So we get physics out of consciousness, and we can do that because physics is just pure math. As you say, we say maths over here, but physics is pure maths. And so as long as you have something that's playing the role of, that can realize those mathematical structures, you can get physics out of facts about consciousness. So it's not like there's the conscious stuff and the physical stuff and they're kind of separate. There's just consciousness stuff, but that realizes the mathematical structures of physics. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded, wasn't it?
No. That's great. And it's also trying to resolve a really challenging problem, which is, I guess, what people call the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically like, how is it that dead material things following the laws of physics give rise or translate to, or whatever, this conscious experience that you and I have, where we can perceive the world, and there is a unique character of all of the colors and experiences. It's a unique experience of what it means to be us and how we experience the world and our thoughts and our visual field and so on, right? And how is it that that consciousness, where does consciousness fit in this mathematical world that you are describing? And that is the hard problem of consciousness, as I understand it. So would you say that like that's the problem that panpsychism is trying to resolve, or one problem?
Exactly. That's the main motivation. So far, I've been describing this crazy view. Why would you take it at all seriously? Well, the motivation is it offers a particularly elegant solution to the hard problem of consciousness. In fact, what it does is it kind of turns the hard problem of consciousness on its head. So the standard approach to the hard problem is to say, okay, we start with matter, the matter of the brain, ultimately understood through physics. We start there, and then we try and get consciousness out of matter. Now, we've been banging our head against a brick wall for many decades now trying to do that, and got precisely nowhere. We've learned a lot about the brain, but we've got precisely nowhere with understanding how electrochemical signaling could produce an inner world of colors and sounds and smells and tastes. And I think there's good reasons to think that just can't be done. We could perhaps talk about that. But at any rate, there's general consensus that it hasn't been done, whether or not it can be done. And we haven't even made any progress on that. It's not like, we've got we've explained how it makes pains, but we haven't explained how it makes colors or something. We're just totally clueless. So that hasn't worked out very well, getting consciousness out of matter. So the panpsychist does it the other way around. Start with consciousness and get physics and matter out of consciousness. And it turns out, actually, surprisingly, that's really easy, because for the reasons we'll be discussing, because physics is purely mathematical, as long as you've got some stuff that realizes the right patterns, the right mathematical structures, you can get physics out of it. So it's really hard, I would argue impossible, to get consciousness out of matter. Really easy to get matter out of consciousness. So that's the motivation.
And it sounds, just listening to you talk, I have two thoughts. The first is I don't think that people realize the depth of the hard problem of consciousness, because we take consciousness for granted. We take consciousness for granted, and we take science and the material world for granted. It's like these two most fundamental things that we experience, we take both of them for granted. And it isn't really until you start to sit down and explore your own consciousness through something like meditation, or maybe psychedelics, or through philosophy, or whatever it is, that you realize that the hard problem is truly a hard problem. And so, I've been 2021 was like the year of meditation for me. And I decided that I need to bone up on my meditation practice. So I really delved into a daily meditation practice, primarily with Sam Harris. And it really demonstrated to me just how hard of a problem it is of understanding how on earth is it that this thing that I call my conscious experience can gel or sync or click with the material world in a real way, or how does that material world give rise to my consciousness? It's a complete mystery. It is like truly the most fundamental thing about us. Our consciousness is maybe the most mysterious thing we've ever encountered. So I think that we tend to take that massively for granted. And just listening to you talk, what you are describing really sounds like ancient mysticism, like forms of Hinduism or Stoicism, like consciousness is at the heart of everything, or consciousness is like at the base of reality, but with maybe like a modern philosophical scientific twist.
Yeah, so two very different points there, but both really interesting. I mean, I think you're totally right that people don't get the the depth of the hard problem. So since the 1990s, people take this very seriously as a serious scientific problem, which wasn't always the case for much of the latter half of the 20th century. Consciousness was just a taboo topic, and you couldn't do, it was thought you can't do serious science on this. So now people take it seriously, but they still, most people think we just need to do a bit more neuroscience. We just need to do a few more experiments. But, you know, what I want to press is this isn't just another phenomenon that we haven't done the right experiments
This
to crack.
being consciousness. Right.
And you know, this is the thing. The thing I'm about to say now is the thing I'm most passionate about getting across to people. The problem is consciousness is not a publicly observable phenomenon, right? You can't look inside someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. Now, you know, science is used to dealing with things you can't observe, like fundamental particles or wave functions or even other universes. Some physicists entertain the idea of. But it's really different. In all of those cases, we postulate things we can't observe to explain what we can observe, right? That's the whole task of science in every other case. We're beholden. The whole task is to account for the data of public observation experiments. In the unique case of consciousness, the thing we are trying to explain is not publicly observable. And that's a totally unique situation. And, you know, it really constrains our capacity to deal with it experimentally. So you know, we can, to an extent, deal with it experimentally, because we can, although I can't see your consciousness, I can ask you what you're feeling, and I can scan your brain while I'm doing that. And then we can start to map up, you know, which kinds of brain activity are correlated with which kinds of experience. And that's a really important experimental scientific project. But that's not the full story, because what we ultimately want to know is why do certain kinds of brain activity go along with certain kinds of experience? Why does brain activity go along with experience at all? And because consciousness is not publicly observable, that's not a question you can just answer with an experiment. And that kind of makes people nervous and, you know, I just want to do the experiments. But, you know, we either pretend it doesn't exist, or we just accept that the standard tools of experimental science aren't going to answer all our questions in this regard.
Right. And so for example, you cannot prove scientifically that I am conscious.
Exactly.
It's basically
exactly.
like I know I'm conscious, but you can't prove that I'm conscious. I could be like a super intelligent web bot that you're seeing on Zoom right now or something. but like, or, you know, I could be a philosophical zombie that has all of the underpinning, you know, is in every single way demonstrating normal human behavior, going to the grocery store, going to a job, having this podcast, but there isn't a conscious interior experience.
Yeah, and absolutely. And so people listening to this might think, oh, well, this is sounding rather far-fetched. Of course you're conscious. And I do believe you're conscious, but this has important implications, because I think in the public mind, the whole task of science, as I've already said, is accounting for what publicly observable data. Now, if I religiously followed that, as it were, I wouldn't believe you're conscious. If I was just trying to explain your publicly observable behavior, I'd just postulate a mechanism to explain it. I would.
So basically,
I'd have no grounds.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm interrupting.
No. Go on.
So basically, what you're saying is there nowhere in a scientific method of the study of Stephen Bradford Long would consciousness arise. Like
Yeah.
Or it's like, if you were to scientifically study Stephen with scientific tools alone, nowhere would consciousness appear.
Yeah, just pretty much a slight qualification. Okay. I guess it depends what you mean by science. I always prefer to say it's not that we can't have a science of consciousness, but we need to rethink what science is.
Got it.
But I think in a way what you said is totally right, because if we have the normal standard understanding of science about explaining public observation experiment, then what you said is totally right. If I was just trying to do a public, explain everything that's publicly observable about you, I would never have any grounds for postulating consciousness. Now, an interesting case in point of this is that the philosopher Daniel Dennett, he is wonderfully consistent on this. His famous book from the 90s, Consciousness Explained, he appreciates that consciousness, in the sense that most people use that term, is not verifiable by public science, and so he doesn't believe in it, right? He's totally consistent. He's consistent. At the other extreme, I'm consistent in thinking, we need to change science to deal with this. I think most people are still in a sort of, in my view, confused middle ground where they think, like, of course consciousness exists, but they don't appreciate that if consciousness exists, if it's real, which of course it is, then there's something we know to be real. There's something we need to account for that goes beyond public observation experiments. And so the job of science isn't just accounting for public observation experiments and then it's job done. There's something extra that we also need our theories to account for, and a new fundamental datum. And so I think that's where we need to get to as a scientific and philosophical community, appreciating that consciousness is the reality of consciousness is a data point in its own right, over and above observation and experiments. That's the thing I'm most kind of passionate about getting across.
So my perception, and I might be wrong about this, and this was really one of the things that I wanted to have you on again to talk about, is how so first of all, to kind of clarify my position, I'm not committed to panpsychism, but I'm open to it. Like I'm open to a lot of shit. I don't know if it's true or not. When people ask me what I think about some big philosophical or political or whatever idea, I'm like, I think I'm a grocery store manager. I don't think I have a clue. Like I know how to sell groceries. That's my real job, actually, is I manage a grocery store. So I'm not committed to the idea, but I find it really, really fascinating. And my perception is that it's gaining some measure of popularity in certain academic worlds and that I would previously have not expected. And so, for example, Annaka Harris, her book came out recently. I forget when it was. It was a year or two ago, called Conscious. And Annaka Harris is Sam Harris's wife. And Annaka Harris says that she explores panpsychism in her book and says that she is open to panpsychism being true. Sam Harris, I think, has said something similar, and that's like very much not what I would have anticipated from someone like Sam Harris. And by the way, because this is the internet and we're all trigger happy, I have to clarify, I'm not a fan of everything Sam Harris has said or done, and so me bringing him up on the show is not, dear listeners, a blanket endorsement of everything that Sam Harris has said. Dear Twitter, before you attack me, just so you know. Yeah, but so all that to say, it's coming from people who I would not have expected someone like Sam Harris to say that. And so I guess what is the state of panpsychism as a philosophy in the scientific community?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting that what were once called the four horsemen of new atheism, I mean, they're all kind of all over the place on consciousness. So, I mean, Daniel Dennett, who we just talked about, is this kind of radical, almost consciousness denying philosopher. Sam Harris, as you say, I think is pretty close to my side, certainly in taking the hard problem very seriously, and pretty much the way my side of the debate would take it, and openness to panpsychism, I think, probably follows from that. Richard Dawkins sort of seems to take the problem seriously, but and I don't know the late Chris Hitchens actually, but yeah. So look, I mean, yeah, I think that a lot has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. You know, when I was first looking for academic jobs, actually, well-meaning professors said, maybe don't mention that panpsychism stuff, you know. But it's just, a lot has changed, and it's, I mean, still a minority view, but it's big. It's just transformed into a well-respected, even though minority position. I mean, one side of this, there's just published quite recently a special issue of the Journal of Consciousness Studies with 19 essays, responses to my book Galileo's Error, not just by philosophers but also by scientists like Carlo Rovelli, Sean Carroll, Lee Smolin, Anil Seth, Christoph Koch. Some very critical, as it should be in these matters of great controversy. But, I think I've had some great interactions with Sean Carroll, the physicist Sean Carroll, he's actually incredibly clued up for someone who's not a professional philosopher. Clued up philosophically, I mean. Of course, he's clued up as a physicist. That's his training and profession. But, and even though him and Anil Seth, for example, strongly disagree with me, I think they take the position seriously enough to engage with it in a serious way. And other scientists like, Lee Smolin, his contribution to this volume was thinking rather speculatively, obviously, about whether the fundamental rethinking of physics we have to do to bring together our best theory of the very big, namely general relativity, with our best theory of the very small, namely quantum mechanics, might involve a role for consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality. Another interesting contribution, actually, by a scientist was Jonathan Delafield Butt, who's an experimental psychologist, professor at the University of Strathclyde, who has found that his career has been studying autism experimentally, and he's discovered that thinking about experimenting on autism within a panpsychist framework, he believes provides a deeper explanatory basis for understanding the phenomenon. And so I'm actually finding more and more scientists getting in touch with me, neuroscientists, physicists, seeing a connection to their work. And I mean, this is one of the great things about writing a book aimed at a general audience. I wrote in 2017 an academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, which has done pretty well amongst academic philosophers, but it's pretty hard to read if you don't have a PhD in philosophy. But then wrote a book aimed at a general audience, and that's been great for connecting to the public, but also connecting to the rest of the scientific community. So I would like to at some point begin to set up some kind of network of scientists and philosophers from a wide range of backgrounds who are all working on this kind of topic. Actually, just finally, there are kind of some hard stats on its place in philosophy. I don't know if you know this. There's this Phil Papers survey, which is no reason why you would know. Actually, I don't know. I
am on top of a lot of shit, but I'm not on top of that.
It's still pretty obscure, but it's a big deal in academic philosophy. So they've done this huge survey of the philosophical views of Anglophone philosophers Anglophone philosophy professors in philosophy departments. So, asking them, do you believe in God? Do you think we have free will? What's the meaning of life? And so on. And on consciousness, the results are about 50% are materialists. So that's still the view that has the most, is the biggest number of adherents. So that's the view that we can explain consciousness in conventional scientific terms. But then 30% are anti-materialists, opposed to think we can't explain consciousness in conventional scientific terms. And then 20% are sort of undecided or don't like the question or something. Philosophers are always awkward. And then of the 30% who oppose materialism, about 3/4 of them are dualists. So they think consciousness is non-physical in some sense. And no, is it 3/4 or 2/3? I can't remember now. I think it's 2/3 actually. No, yeah, it's a little bit better for it. 2/3 are dualists and 1/3 are panpsychists. So it's still very much a kind of minority position. But the last time they did this, panpsychism wasn't even mentioned. So it's really it's kind of the third position. A little bit like in Britain, we have two big parties, Labour and Conservatives, and then we've got the Liberal Democrats, the sort of a big third party.
So it's sort of, you're the Green Party of...
We're the Green Party, yeah. I just thought of this analogy as
consciousness.
So it's on the table. It's one of the positions people now feel, they have to consider, they have to take seriously. And, the trajectory is upwards. And there's all sorts of things I could mention, actually. I don't want to talk too much, but one exciting thing, again, only in academic philosophy, but there's this guy, Michael Tye, who you won't know if you're not heavily in academic philosophy, but a huge figure of materialism, a very influential materialist, going back to the 80s, has just converted to a form of panpsychism, and that's like it's like Richard Dawkins becoming a Christian. Wow! And another big notable thing,
or Sam Harris becoming a Muslim, or
or
whatever.
Maybe a bit less extreme, but and just one more thing. The big annual philosophy conference in the UK had a plenary session on panpsychism for the first time last summer.
Wow.
So in all sorts of ways, this is, it's not like everyone believes it now, but no one agrees on anything in philosophy, but it's become on the table, even to some extent among neuroscientists.
It's part of the conversation now in a way that it wasn't. And so you mentioned the one philosopher who was like Dawkins converting to Christianity. What was his name again?
Michael Tye, Tye.
Okay, so Michael Tye. You don't need to speak for him on his behalf, but what was it that would convert him, kind of a lifelong materialist, to a panpsychist position?
Good question. And so I still haven't read his book. I need to get around to this. But I understand that the basic thing that's converted him is actually something I don't think this is too technical. It's something I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is the issue of whether consciousness can be vague in this kind of slightly technical philosophical sense, where something's vague if you can have borderline cases of it. So, for example, being tall is vague. Like, some people are definitely tall, some people are definitely not tall. But then there are I'm in the borderline case. It's probably, I'm kind of neither definitely tall nor definitely not tall. Baldness is another one that I'm entering into now. Like, some people are definitely bald if you got no hair. Some people are definitely not bald, but I'm kind of, am I bald? Am I not bald? It's getting thin. Right. Now, here's a question. Could consciousness be like that? So a good way of framing it, like, could there be some creature that's, let's say snails for the sake of an example, let's say, could it be that snails are in the borderline case? So then they're not conscious. They're not definitely conscious. They're not definitely non-conscious. They're in the borderline case. Now, I just think that makes no sense at all. They might have very simple consciousness, but they either have experience or they don't. It can't, even if they've just got a little bit of experience, either the lights are on or they're not. Very good paper by the philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel on this recently, which you should get on. Eric Schwitzgebel's. He defends with a view he calls crazyism, which is that whatever the solution to consciousness is, it's going to be crazy. And he actually
I feel like that is my position. I feel like I have finally discovered my position on consciousness.
Crazy. But so I think Michael Tye's really on board with that. He thinks it doesn't make sense for consciousness to be vague. And then this makes a big problem now if we think about, if you're not a panpsychist, when you start to think about the emergence of consciousness, either in evolutionary history or just waking up, or like a fetus, an embryo becoming a fetus. So if you think consciousness can't be vague, something's either definitely conscious or not, then there's going to have to be an utterly sharp cutoff point,
right,
where something becomes conscious. Like, let's imagine the embryo. Presumably, let's say an embryo isn't conscious, so it's becoming a fetus. There's going to be some utterly sharp cutoff point when, like, an atom moves a tiny bit, and that just seems really implausible. Because, in general, you don't have this problem because most things are vague. Like, there's no exact point where someone gets old. It's vague. They enter a borderline case. But if consciousness can't be vague like that, then there's going to be some utterly sharp cutoff point, and that seems really implausible. So it becomes more plausible to think, well, it's just there all along in some form, and in evolutionary history, it becomes more complex. Natural selection molds it into more complex forms. In fact, soon after Darwin, many philosophers and psychologists saw the connection to a panpsychist worldview, to Darwinism. If you're a panpsychist, you just think there were simple forms of consciousness, and through evolution, they became more complex forms of consciousness. So it's that kind of it's those kinds of considerations that are motivating Michael Tye. Does that kind of make sense?
That does make sense. And, I find myself having like these exact same thoughts when I watch my tarantula. I have a pet tarantula named Gertrude, and she's Gertrude the tarantula. She's mostly like a fluffy, cantankerous paperweight, but this might be because I am anthropomorphizing her some, so I always have to be careful of that. But it seems like there's definitely something there. Like there's definitely a spark of something. She kind of has her own personality. She kind of has her. She responds, she reacts, she some days she likes to be petted, other days she doesn't, and so she has like weird moods. Some days she prefers to hide, other days she's out and about. Like there's something there. But it's a ganglia. Her brain isn't a brain. It's a ganglia. It's just this random collection of nerves. And so and so I find myself asking, okay, at what point, like, does an arachnid have consciousness, and what life forms beneath arachnids have and at what level of complexity does consciousness turn on? Like, do plants have consciousness? How do I know? Like, at what point does it turn on or off? And so so I find myself asking like the same questions.
Yeah, I mean, and it's certainly not the case that everyone is a panpsychist now, but the trajectory, I think, of scientists and philosophers is definitely to attributing consciousness to more things. It used to be the consensus that fish were not conscious, that birds were not conscious, that babies were not conscious, which is why we often...
Or dogs, cats and dogs. Like it used to be, like I read, I forget where I read this, but frequently, horrible things were done to animals because it was assumed that they were just kind of automatons. There was not an inner conscious experience. And so that justified horrific things being done to animals. And it kind of, goes back to the point of what you were saying earlier in the episode, where looking at the creature itself, you cannot determine whether there is or is not consciousness. And in previous ages, people have looked at super intelligent creatures like cats and dogs and whatnot and decided there was no conscious experience there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and certainly René Descartes thought that animals were just mere mechanisms. And, I mean, he was partly, it might make a difference, the kind of technology you have at the time. Descartes, when Descartes lived, they just started getting these very basic automatons. I think were they run by water or something? I can't remember the details.
They're
I read
creepy as fuck too.
Yeah. You see these things. So I mean, you can imagine Descartes thinking, that's pretty impressive what you can do with just a mechanism. Mm-hmm. So maybe animals are like that. And but then now we have computers, and you think, Jesus Christ, what they can do, and just with kind of as a mere mechanism. So you think, oh, maybe that's what's going on with us as well. Descartes, so Descartes thought a mechanism could never have language, could never sort of respond in a meaningful way, because he thought language was essentially creative and involved responding in new ways to new contexts. So he thought that a mechanism could never achieve that. But, as you start to look at AI and, I mean, it's, as I say, in the case of human beings, we can make some progress identifying what is required for consciousness. Although, even there, actually, there's not really any consensus.
Hmm.
There's huge debate over whether consciousness is in the front of the brain or in the back of the brain, and I mean, this partly depends on. Some people think there's a dispute among scientists on whether you could have experiences that you don't notice, right?
Yes, right.
So like take the, like the clothes on your body now, the feel of your clothes on your, now I've mentioned that, you sort of attending to it. But before I mentioned it, were you aware of the clothes on your body? So some philosophers and scientists want to say, it doesn't make you, if you weren't aware of it, you didn't experience it. It's only when you actually attend to it that you experience it. But other philosophers want to say, yeah, before I mentioned it, you experienced the feel of the clothes on your body. It's just that you didn't notice it. You weren't aware that you were experiencing it. And which way you go on that, you're going to end up with really different predictions for your neuroscientific theory. And so if you think there's a close connection between what we call attention, like attending to a mental state, and experience, then you're going to think it's located in the front of the brain where you've got things like working memory and so on. Whereas those who think, no, you can have all sorts of experiences you're not aware of, they tend to think it's at the back of the brain. And so, I mean, even in the human case, it's just a bloody mess. As we get to creatures more distant from human beings, it looks really hard to settle the matter. And it's a mess. But I just think we've just got to do the best we can and have our best guess at what the facts are here.
So you mentioned that there was a journal that published several responses to your book. If you were to Iron Man the arguments against panpsychism, what would that position be?
You have to subscribe to the journal to get the papers, but a lot of the authors have put them online, and I've got a blog post with links to many of the papers. And so Sean Carroll's is freely available online. And then my response. So I've got a paper responding to all the papers. So then there's my response. And then Sean Carroll came on to my podcast, Mind Chat, quick plug there, which I run with someone who's got the polar opposite opinion to me on consciousness, another philosophy professor, Keith Frankish. He doesn't believe consciousness exists. So the gimmick
I should have him on the show.
Yeah, you should do.
That'd be
great.
fun.
So I think consciousness is everywhere. He thinks it's nowhere. So we both agree that you can't explain consciousness in conventional scientific terms. So I draw from that, we need to rethink science. He draws from that it doesn't exist. It's like magic or fairy dust or something. Anyway, I'm digressing. So we had Sean Carroll on. We had a 3-hour debate about this, and then he wrote a blog post, and then we've been arguing on Twitter, and I think we're going to get him back on. But basically the argument is, there's numerous aspects to this, but one part of it is how much does physics constrain our theory of consciousness? So Sean thinks, we already really have a pretty strong understanding of the physics in our bodies and brains. So it's well known, and I referred to it earlier, that physics is not complete because our best theory of big things, general relativity, doesn't fit together with our best theory of little things. But actually, the areas where they clash only turn up really in very in extreme circumstances, like when you're about to fall in a black hole or something. In the ordinary terrestrial circumstances of the Earth, actually we can bring those theories together. So Sean Carroll thinks we know the physics in our bodies and brains, what he calls the core theory. And so if consciousness were playing a fundamental feature in the physical world, then that would mess up our physics, right? Because we'd have to take that into account. And so there must be something wrong with my theory, right? So he thinks, we should start with what we do understand, like the physics of our bodies and brains, and fit consciousness in somehow around that, rather than what I do, which is the other way around. So I mean, partly I just still think he doesn't quite get how the panpsychist view works. So it's not that, as we've already touched on, it's not that consciousness is this extra thing that we need to plug into our physics. The idea is consciousness underlies physics. Here's another analogy to put the point. If you think of like software and hardware, right? If you think, suppose you understand the software of your computer, and then you understand there's this mechanism, this hardware underneath it. That's not like some new thing. That's what underlies the software. It's the hardware that makes Microsoft Word run. So for the panpsychist, if you think of physics as like the software, it's like the program, and consciousness is the hardware that underlies it. Physics is just this abstract mathematical program, and physics kind of runs the show. So that's one dispute. But also, I just think we don't know enough about the brain yet to know whether there are new causal forces that arise in living brains that are not apparent to physicists, because physicists deal with, their experiments are in quite specific circumstances. We really don't know very much about the causal dynamics of a living brain. The great book by Matthew Cobb, the neuroscientist, The Idea of the Brain, which is wonderful. I recommend it to everyone. It's like a wonderful intellectual history of our scientific understanding of the brain, going back to when we thought the mind was in the heart. But basically, we know a lot about the basic chemistry of the brain, how neurons fire, calcium chambers, action potentials. We know a lot about large-scale functions. So like the top and the bottom. What we're almost clueless on is how the large-scale functions of the brain are realized at the cellular level, how the brain bloody works. And I think we'd need to know a lot more about that before we knew whether everything's reducible to underlying chemistry or physics.
So it's like we can point to correspondences. Maybe that's the wrong word, but it's like what we can point at is, okay, we know that this part of the brain or this function happens when this experience happens in consciousness, but we can't explain why. Is that what I'm hearing you say? Okay.
Yeah, that's part of it. And also just, I suppose Sean is thinking, look, physics works in building rockets. It works in all this technology. And so we should assume it's basically the same in living bodies and brains, even if we haven't investigated to prove that. Here's an analogy I thought of the other day that I haven't said to anyone, actually. I suppose it's like all the swans we've seen are white. But we've never been to Australia. But it's reasonable to suppose, look, we've seen a lot of swans in a lot of places. Probably they're all going to be white. But if we haven't actually been to Australia, is it Australia where they have black swans?
I don't know. Let's say Australia has all kinds of crazy shit. Not only are they black swans, they're probably like, velociraptors that can, black velociraptor swans that can kill us.
So we should still be slightly agnostic as to whether, because we haven't been to Australia, maybe the swans there aren't white. I kind of feel the same about that. I think, physics works in a lot of places and it's the same. So yeah, okay, you can kind of think it's some probability it's going to be the same in living brains, but we don't really know enough about living brains to know whether that's the case. I'm not saying whether something spooky or spiritual pops up, but whether there are causal dynamics in the brain that are not totally reducible to underlying chemistry and physics. And there are people investigating this. I mean, there's a scientist, Martin Picard at Columbia University, has the psychobiology lab, and he's studying mitochondria in the brain, and under the working hypothesis that these are not, their behavior is actually to be understood as social networks and is not reducible to underlying chemistry or physics. So that would, if that turns out to be true, you see what I mean? I'm explaining this a bit clearer as I go along. Then Sean Carroll will be wrong. Sean Carroll's bet is everything's reducible to underlying chemistry or physics. If Martin Picard is right and there are these irreducible social networks of the mitochondria in the brain that are not reducible to underlying chemistry and physics, then that bet is proved false. And I just think we need to be more agnostic because the brain is still massively, massively unknown. People get excited by brain scans, but every pixel on a brain scan corresponds to 5.5 million neurons. It's very low resolution.
It's like it's like trying to determine geopolitics by looking at Earth from space, like from the moon. That's what brain scans are like. Like, they're incredibly helpful. They're very, very important, but they're so low resolution that it's basically like trying to understand, the interactions between America and the UK by watching the planet Earth from Jupiter. Like, it doesn't work very well.
Yeah. And a lot of neuroscientists think that. A lot of neuroscientists refer to neuroscientists who use too many brain scans as snake oil salesmen. There have been I mean, that's not fair. There's a lot of important stuff, but I guess it's the thing the media jump onto, don't it? Oh my God, we've identified the bit of the brain that does classical music or something. Anyway,
well,
but a lot of unknowns.
Are you familiar with the work of Jaron Lanier? I
don't think I am.
So he is one of my favorite writers, and he is like the grandfather of augmented reality and virtual reality, and he writes a lot about computer science, and he was one of the scientists in charge of Internet 2.0, which was, bringing the internet out of the university system and to the public. But he's ultimately kind of a philosopher, and I'm going to totally botch his argument here, but he has a book called You Are Not a Gadget. And I think that the basic idea is we tend to see we tend to reduce human beings to gadgets because that is we see humanity through the lens of our prevailing technology. And so, use and so when I hear arguments like when I hear arguments like what Sean Carroll puts forth, who, let me just clarify, is probably like a million times smarter than me. So the man is a fucking genius. I actually tried to get him on the podcast, and he sent me like a very polite emails declining. But everyone needs to go listen to his Mindscape podcast and read his books on quantum physics. Yeah. The man is a genius.
Including the episode that had me on.
Yes, that's how I discovered you, by the way. That's because I listened to that fight that you had with Sean Carroll on his podcast. But
right, it goes on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, you're good. I sometimes wonder if when we take a mechanistic approach to consciousness and the brain, that we are actually imposing the predominant technology onto ourselves. And so, you look through history and it's like, well, we used to describe ourselves and the universe. It isn't just ourselves, it's also the universe. We, like, back when the clock was invented, suddenly there was the clockwork universe. Suddenly there was the great clockmaker being God, or the great watchmaker being God. And then suddenly there was, we were clockwork, and biological processes working as clockwork, and so on and so forth, right? And so it's like we tend to see not just ourselves, but all of reality through the predominant technology. And so it's almost like inverse anthropomorphizing or something, where, and I just sometimes, I don't know, I don't know what consciousness is. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. To quote the fifth tenet of the Satanic Temple, one should, let's see here, we should do our best never to distort scientific facts to fit our beliefs. But I sometimes wonder if consciousness is actually more mysterious, and that it actually might be something completely other than a computer. why are we so confident? Why are we so confident that the brain is a computer? Why are we so confident that the mind is a computer? And that to me is a proposition that is just kind of assumed. And that it is not at all clear to me that consciousness is basically like an operating system or a computer program that is, that to me is just an assumption kind of carrying on this grand legacy of imposing our latest technology on to our experience, when the fact is it might be something completely different than that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think certainly with the computer case, I think neuroscientists are already on the whole seeing the failings of the mind as a computer model. And I think in connection to free will as well, I think one of my controversial views is I'm more agnostic but somewhat open to the reality of free will, and free will in the strong sense of what philosophers call libertarian free will, that some of our decisions are uncaused.
We should talk about that sometime, because I'm the opposite. I think I gear towards there being no free will.
Oh, that'd be good to discuss.
Yeah.
But so one thing, I'm somewhat agnostic. We've got to be more agnostic than with consciousness, because it could turn out to be an illusion in a way that it's hard to make sense of the feeling of pain being an illusion or something. But I am actually, and we might want to argue about this, I'm actually convinced, for the reasons I've just been saying, we really don't know enough about the brain to be able to rule it out. And yet, so many people are just totally convinced that science has ruled it out. And I think that's part of a sort of zeitgeist, a sort of feel about how science is supposed to look, based perhaps on analogies with technology rather than something we've got experiments to back up. Well, we had the neuroscientist Anil Seth on our podcast after his recent book, Being You. It's a great book. But, I challenged him on free will. I said, your chapter, you quickly reject strong libertarian free will. You call it spooky, but what is the argument? And it was just sort of, it's spooky, you really believe in that? Oh, it's magic. Okay, look, maybe it's not there, but I think we need to be clear on, what exactly is the reason to doubt this thing. And so, even if there are, anyway.
No, it's fascinating, and obviously we have so much more to talk about, and I'd love to have you on again. Hopefully, without a 2-year break in between episodes. I would love to have you back on soonish rather than later.
Well, I'm just this week, just yesterday, started a new book, which I'm hoping to get a draft of by Easter. I've got a precious term off teaching to write
Amazing.
a book. So maybe we can talk about that at some future point.
What's the book about?
The purpose of existence.
Wow, going big. Well, I can't wait to read it. We should definitely.
So I'm thinking you're thinking that basically that God doesn't exist, but there is a purpose to the universe.
Are you
a middle way between God and atheism? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, well, are you a non-theist or atheist or agnostic?
I don't fit nicely into this dichotomy. So I'm definitely an atheist about the traditional omni-God, or because of the problem of evil and suffering. I don't think it's plausible an all-powerful loving God would create a universe like this with, create us through the horrific process of natural selection and so on. But I don't take the standard atheist view that we're in a totally meaningless universe. I do think there's pretty good evidence to take seriously the possibility that there is some kind of purpose, some kind of directionality in the universe. So, and it's just kind of hugely underexplored. We get stuck in these dichotomies of sort of Soviet communism or US capitalism, and
Yeah.
Which team are you on? Are you a Dawkins atheist, or do you think the Pope's right? Who? And I've just always found neither option. I think there's problems with both options. So I want to really, and actually we do think of a middle way, but we think of it as fluffy thinking and new age sort of not really. And I just want to do a really serious, rigorous, exploration of a middle ground option between traditional God and meaningless universe. And yeah,
I'm right there with you. That's kind of how I describe myself as a non-theist, and I like that word because it has more of a religious connotation to it, and it's not as hard as atheist culturally, and it. Anyway, we don't need to go down that road, but because we need to wrap this up. But for people who are interested in following your work, listening to your podcast, reading your book, breaking into your classes at Durham and listening in, where can they do that? Where can they find you online?
Yeah, come along. Philip Goff Philosophy, my website.
Is that .com? Is that .com? Philip Goff?
.com it is.
Okay.
Geo Foxtrot. And I do have a blog on there. I've got the most horribly titled blogs, but it's linked to from my website. And Twitter, Philip_Goff. Spend too much time arguing on Twitter. What else? Mind Chat is the podcast. And lots of videos and popular articles and stuff on website. Yeah, I try to write every academic article. I try to write a popular version of it, and I need to get back to the academic work. Actually, I'm sort of getting too taken up by the. I want to. It's nice to write stuff that people actually read. So then, but I should probably, if I want to get promoted at some point, I'd probably get back to writing some academic papers. But
amazing. All right. Well, this has been great, and you are welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. It's been very nice chatting. I love your decor. This is just audio, right?
Oh, yes, this is just audio. Yeah, my decor. This is my office. I have my satanic altar right there behind me.
Fantastic.
With tarot. I have like occult accoutrement all over this room.
Right. We need to talk about religious fictionalism.
Yes,
as well.
I still want to do that.
I'm a kind of church-going person who doesn't kind of take it literally, and but my wife doesn't go with me, but we actually following from your podcast, I know if I mentioned this, I watched the Netflix documentary on the Satanic Temple. Is it?
Yes.
And we were both thinking, this could be a religion we could both go to.
All right, well, it is great talking to you, and that is it for this show. The theme song is Wild by 11D7. You can find it on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to music. The show is written, produced, and edited by me, Stephen Bradford Long, and it is a production of Rock Candy Recordings. As always, hail Satan, and thanks for listening.